Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeff Simon. I'm with Office Managing Partner here in Kansas City for Hush Blackwell Law Firm. And I want to thank you for attending today's session on the history of structural racism, both here and nationally. I especially want to thank the Kansas City Chamber of Commerce and the Urban Neighborhood Initiative for putting together these listening sessions on the issue that is the most important issue of our time. If there is not change that comes out of these times, I don't know that there ever will be, and that will not be a good thing for anyone. So all of us need to learn what is going on and what is causing what we are seeing in our streets and throughout our society today on the issue of race. And I thank you for joining us today. The issue today is structural racism, and we can all recognize overt racism when we see it and deplore it, and hopefully we act on it. Systemic or institutionalized racism is often much more difficult to identify and to understand, and most particularly for those of us in the majority, for white people, because you see, we've never been held back by systemic racism. It's never touched us. We've always been allowed to do whatever we want to do in whatever institution or organization we're in. What we need to recognize is that has not been the case for people of color in this country. And it is incumbent upon those of us who are sincere in our desire to do something to make change in the area of racial inequality and inclusive prosperity, that we understand what the causes are for how we got here today and can identify then what needs to change to make change happen. Whether you see systemic racism or not, you cannot deny that it exists. All one has to do is look at disparities in healthcare outcomes in this country, and employment opportunities in this country, in the creation of wealth. Criminal justice statistics: people of color are arrested and charged much more often than whites. The sentences they receive in the criminal justice system. Virtually in every form of society, there is a deeply embedded systemic racism that is causing a lot of the inequalities we see. And until we understand what those are, we can't begin to change them. So again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to the Chamber and to the Urban Neighborhood Initiative for putting these sessions together. It is now my privilege to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Gwen Grant, the president of the Urban League of Kansas City. Gwen is a person I consider a true friend. She's a person who's taught me a lot about race and racism in this city and in this country and throughout the history of our country. She is a leader and a clear, strong voice in our community for equality and calling out the truth, even when it's not easy to do so. So it really is my privilege to introduce my friend, my companion, and someone for whom I have enormous respect, and the moderator of today's panel, Gwen Grant. Hi, Gwen.
So, Jeff, I want to thank you for the very kind introduction, and thanks to Joe Reardon and Kathy Bennett at the Chamber for inviting me to serve as your moderator for this very important listening session. We've got a fast-paced discussion ahead, so I'm going to get right back to introducing the stellar panel. We'll begin with Dr. Clarence Lang. Dr. Lang is the Dean of the College of the Liberal Arts and Professor of African American Studies at Penn State University. Prior to joining Penn State University, Dr. Lang served as the Interim Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and Director of African American Studies at Kansas University. Next, we have Albert Joseph Lowe IV. AJ, as I call him, is the African and American History Professor at MCC-Penn Valley and co-host of KKFI's Ebony Bones, a kitchen table conversation that explores the plight of Black folks. We have Jamala Rogers. Jamala is the founding member and executive director of the Organization for Black Struggle. Jamala is a proud graduate of Central High School in Kansas City, Missouri, and she's a longtime organizer and columnist. Her last book is Ferguson is America, Roots and Rebellion. Last but not least, we have Geri Sanders. Geri is Senior Manager of Collections at the American Jazz Museum and a local historian who is well-versed on Kansas City's historically segregated schools, pools, 18th and Vine, funeral homes, and burial grounds. Structural racism is the foundation on which the socioeconomic infrastructure of this nation was built. From economics to law enforcement to education to healthcare and beyond, Black Americans have been systematically denied equal and equitable access to every aspect of the American dream. This two-part series, The History of Structural Racism Nationally and in Greater Kansas City, will take a look at the role historical and contemporary discrimination have played in the formation of policies and practices that created and sustained racial disparities. According to the Urban Institute, understanding structural racism and the historical context of racial disparities in law enforcement, health, home ownership, education, and beyond reveals a more accurate national and local narrative in which government-sanctioned policies and practices have facilitated upward mobility for white Americans and created barriers to mobility for Black Americans. Policies, more than choices, culture, or genes, explain disparate outcomes because race has no biological basis and was created solely to justify and facilitate systemic oppression. Placing disparities in their rightful context can help challenge biases by shifting the blame away from people and communities of color. For example, researchers may report higher arrest rates among Black men than among white men. Taken at face value, these statistics may confirm racist stereotypes of Black men as violent and prone to criminality. But if we discuss the role history has played in the formation of structurally racist policing practices, racially discriminatory drug laws, and redlining in creating these disparities, we can cause people to question the stereotypes they hold. So let's get this started. My first question goes to Dr. Clarence Lang. Starting with slavery, walk us through how structural racism got its start and how it is manifested in law enforcement and economics.
So let me start with just, Gwen, thanking you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I want to say hi to Jeff, good to see him again. Jamala Rogers, who's been a mentor to me. I'm glad to see her and glad to be back in the Kansas City area virtually. I'm in Pennsylvania, but happy to be with this group. I mean, I think that probably the most succinct way to begin the conversation, Gwen, if you don't mind, is just I think to make the point that if we think about what the status of Black people in this society has been historically and up until the present, I think it's important that we put aside the idea that that condition has been one of being the targets of prejudice and bias. That is the problem that Black people have historically faced and face in the present moment is not about simply bad attitudes and beliefs, but rather Black people's role historically and to the present has been one of racial oppression, which I think gets at the point of the structural nature of Black people's condition collectively, even though individually people have fared differently. And the point becomes, if we look over the course of history, what does that mean? That means that the relationship has been one fundamentally of economic exploitation and marginalization. It's been one of cultural domination and degradation. And those relationships have been rooted in coercion, control, and violence. And that has situated Black people's relationship to the major institutions in the society. I can certainly talk about what this looks like in higher ed, but we can talk about K through 12. We can talk about the employment sector. Certainly we can have a conversation about the criminal justice system with regard to the explosion of mass incarceration over the past 40 years. And we can chart that from Black people's beginnings in this society in slavery, through Jim Crow segregation, through the rise of mass incarceration, to this moment that we find ourselves in right now. And certainly that has conditioned Black people's relationship to law enforcement, which is a key question that's been on the table for some time here and currently. And I want to add that those legacies of cultural degradation, economic exploitation and marginalization, coercion, control, and violence, those legacies have been amplified, in my view, by what we're seeing in social policy in terms of a neglect and even an active attack on the social provisioning, social welfare functions of government, and an attack on the idea that government has a responsibility to care for and protect members of society, especially the most vulnerable. And we've seen that around this COVID-19 crisis, where we see the failures of government to create and maintain caring functions. And that is, of course, having a disproportionate impact on communities of color. So we have to understand the spike in racialized violence and police violence as a manifestation of that in this moment. And I think as a result, we have witnessed a persistent, and I'm going to say, in fact, growing pattern of inequality across class as well as race that is disproportionately impacted low-wage service workers, rent-burdened households, the medically underinsured or uninsured. So I'm making a point that this is historic, that we can trace the different manifestations of this across time that takes us up to this present, aside from the history lesson that I can give. But the origins, of course, are in slavery and the violence that fundamentally rooted those relationships that we see continue today.
So I'm going to follow up. I need to ask you to provide, just take, 30, 40 seconds and paint the historical picture. You know, my question was slavery, law enforcement, slavery, economics. So if you could just kind of draw that relationship in terms of, if we talk about how the slave patrols then evolved into creating the law enforcement system, which was born out of a brutality against slaves, and how was that built into, how did that contribute to this structurally racist justice system?
I will do it very quickly and will not do justice to it, but I'll try. So if we think about the fact that the way that a slave system functioned was through coercion and control of Black bodies and people, right? As you mentioned, slave patrols played a part in that, the forms of discipline that occurred. Slavery ends, right? And there emerges very quickly an effort to keep Black people as close to a condition of slavery as is possible. And so then you have, coming on the heels of the end of slavery, various kinds of Black codes, vagrancy laws, ultimately the emergence of the convict leasing system, right? To maintain Black people's labor, but to control their ability to make decisions about their own lives. And we can even talk about how the sharecropping system functioned hand in hand with that as well. So this violence, control, coercion, that's geared toward extracting from Black people the value of their labor. An interesting thing happens as we move into the 20th century. Black people were part of industry. We have downturns in industrial production. And a curious thing happens. Black people become economically redundant, right? So the demand for Black labor changes. How is that addressed? The issues of unemployment, the various kinds of social issues that Black people are dealing with, ends up getting disappeared into what? The emergence of mass incarceration as a way of disappearing these social problems, still maintaining this control of Black bodies and lives, but also finding new ways to extract value out of Black people's labor as well, through the kinds of labor that occurs through the prison system. And so the police from the 19th through the 20th century have been very important to that, very quickly, because you can't do this in 30 to 40 seconds. But if we think about what's happened in cities like Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, when you've had urban redevelopment occur, right? And that's meant the displacement of Black communities, right? Among other things, police forces have become, right, did become vehicles for also enforcing, right, the comings and goings of Black people, and certainly in ways that I can't talk about, but Jamala could. If we think about what happened in Ferguson, right? That was built around, in many respects, this notion of extracting from Black people through ticket fines or what have you, value as a way of maintaining the tax bases of these declining inner ring suburbs like Ferguson, Matson, Illinois, because we could talk about all across the nation. That's a very quick, truncated, not very satisfying, but this nexus of Black people's labor, coercion, and the role of police in enforcing that is something that we can trace across the breadth and width of African American history.
Thank you so much. Now, see, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I wanted to hear from you, Doc. So, you know, that's what I needed. Thank you. And it's important that we, you know, this is an important conversation. And so we're gonna adjust in terms of how we go. I may ask a follow-up question if you don't answer the question, if we don't get to the crux of the matter in your responses. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question is Jamala. So I think Dr. Lang set you up quite well. And so in terms of the question that I have for you, in your book, Ferguson is America, you wrote about years of political disenfranchisement, broken promises, police harassment, and economic injustices. So talk a little bit about how Black codes and of the South emerged in Missouri and how they play out in contemporary society.
So yeah, thank you for inviting me. And I think the issue of structural racism is one that definitely needs to be front and center, not just racism, not just individual racism, but structural racism. So I think it's a long time coming to have this kind of public discourse. So yes, I think Clarence definitely gave me a platform, but I would say that in Missouri, before Black folks were here, there were Native Americans, and basically the white settlers who came said, like, this is white man's country. And so they proceeded to annihilate the Native Americans, pushed them out. The ones that were left were victims of genocide. And then here we come. And so, so the Black codes followed us in St. Louis. A number of those issues were codified in law. So here in Missouri, we have the Dred Scott decision, which in many ways, the way that I'm looking at it, was the funky wet blanket that covered all of the race relationships here and the power dynamics, because Judge Taney said basically there's no rights that white people have to respect Black people, and that has permeated throughout everything. But I think when you look at, for example, someplace as obscure as a Ferguson, Missouri, that people hadn't even known about, wasn't really on the map until August 9th, 2014. And all of a sudden people are saying, why? What's there? And you see this accumulation of injustices, of structural racism that was kept in place to actually support white supremacy. So for many people, when the spotlight finally shone on Ferguson, they saw that here you had pretty much an all-white government, you know, city council, police department, whatever, and a 70% African-American population. How could that happen and be happening in 2014? I mean, it was almost like some special version of apartheid. So all of those things really kind of connect to keep the system propped up and to keep white supremacy front and center. And so the good thing about Ferguson is that when people found out what had happened, it was almost like stripping all of the peeling of the onion, and you saw what was raw right there. But basically, the message was Black people can live here, but they're gonna have no voice and they aren't gonna have any power. And all of that has subsequently changed. But still, for that to be happening in 2014 still was not an anomaly, let me say that. So I think when we look at Dred Scott and we look at any of the other laws that help to prop up white supremacy, come straight out of the Black codes. That's why one of the chants out of Ferguson was the whole damn system is guilty as hell, because you saw this interlocking, layered processes as well as laws and legislature and practices that stood to keep Black people suppressed and down.
Okay, all right, so we're gonna, thank you, Jamala. So Geri, so we're looking back on, on education, on public accommodations, and in the history of 18th and Vine. What policies and practices were in place that are emblematic of structural racism in Kansas City?
Well, thank you, Gwen, for giving me this opportunity as well. I just wanted to make sure I said that before I start talking about that there were too many policies, too many practices to almost to talk about. Everything was segregated here in Kansas City. The pools, like I say, the pools, the schools, the hospitals, the movie theaters, all public accommodations, even the cemeteries, of course, you know that. These were in violation of the 14th Amendment, and I wrote it down because I wanted to read it. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And that includes every last one. We have 50 states and the District of Columbia. And so a lot of times all of these states are in violation of the 14th Amendment. But then after the 14th Amendment, there were so many different issues that came up. There were several Supreme Court decisions. And I really like to say that people always think that, okay, if we pass a law, then we can legislate morality. And I believe in my heart that that is the one thing that you cannot do. You can put out the law, but that does not necessarily mean that everybody will abide by it. So we have, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson, Shelley versus Kramer, and I like to even talk about Loving versus Virginia. So there were so many of these until it's just so, I just cannot, like list them all. But one of the things that happened in Kansas City, of course, was J.C. Nichols. He was the orchestrator of the racial covenances almost all over the country. He had a little handbook that he would give out to different people and show them how they would be able to legally segregate their areas so that it will exclude those people that he did not want to be there. So I'm not going to try to take up too much time, but you would just ask me about the number of policies. I just want to kind of focus on one, and that was the desegregation of Swope Park Pool. I like to talk about that one because it was a valiant attempt by several young people that wanted to change that policy that African Americans could not swim in Swope Park Pool. Now, you know that we were allowed at a lot of different places in Swope Park, every place except the pool and the golf course. I don't know why, but I do know why. So we were able to picnic, we were able to fish, we were able to run, do everything else that we wanted to do, but we could not swim. So 3 students decided that they would take up this cause and go ahead and try to desegregate the pool. Thurgood Marshall actually was called into Kansas City in 1950 as the lead for the NAACP on this particular case. And when he came, he was immediately taken off the case because they were digging into his background and said that he allegedly was very active with the Communist Party, and therefore he could not actually lead this case for the NAACP. And I like to say that because that is 3 years before our neighbors down the road in Topeka with Brown versus Board of Education. And then just to bring things up to how they kind of relate to today, if I can, I just want to say that there was an incident, and I actually wrote it down, July 3rd, 2019. So it is 1 year ago today that there was an incident in a Lee Summit pool, a community pool. 2 white girls and a Black youth, a teen, were trying to swim in that pool in Lee Summit. The Black teen actually lived in the community, and she was harassed and yelled at and told to leave the pool immediately because they were tired of having people that didn't live in their community come and swim in the pool. Well, that didn't go over too well. It got captured on video, of course, on our cameras that we have, and it made the news. And so what happened after that, she went home, she got out of the pool, her and her friends, and they did not swim because, they were just so intimidated by these 2 big white guys yelling at them. And the father came back, and then they did make an official apology because they said they didn't think that she lived in the community. And that was the whole issue. So that, I mean, like, just to relate from then to now, it's the same issue. Things have not really changed that much since the 1950s. So I just wanted to kind of interject that. But even with the 18th and Vine District, you know, we were set up into a boundary. But in spite of everything that happened in the 1920s, or even right after slavery, or when the 18th and Vine District was, when it came about, I like to say that I'm very proud of how Black people came together and developed their own sense of community in the Vine Street corridor. And one example of that is Homer B. Roberts, who was the first African-American to open up an automobile dealership right at 19th and Vine. And that's in the whole US of A. So while I was doing my research on him, I uncovered the story of Sarah Rector right around 1994. I started doing research on her. And some of you might know her as, I've written about her as Kansas City's first Black millionaires. But she basically is in this biography of Homer B. Roberts, An Extraordinary Man, which of course was written by Rusty Rastusha with Sonny Gibson, which so many people know, and myself, and it was published in 2001. So that story is out there for anybody who would like to kind of take advantage of reading it. So thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Geri. Could you, if you can put it into the chat or anything, any link to the book or to the story that you're referencing, so that our attendees can access that. Just to add a little bit to what you were saying about the integration in Swope Park Pool and the issue that was the issues that were most difficult, the pool and the golf course. Just to add a little bit more history to that, during that time, the leader of the Urban League was Mr. Thomas Webster. And Thomas Webster was very much involved in working to integrate the golf course and the pool at Swope Park. And in fact, he was forced out of his role as executive director of the Urban League through the Hope Chest, which was then, that was the name of United Way back in the day. The Hope Chest threatened to pull their funding from the Urban League if Thomas Webster remained in his role, because he was pushing for integration in public accommodations, and he was also involved in pushing for desegregation of public schools. So that's just another little tidbit of history for you. So let's move on. AJ. So there's a great deal of data and research showing the connection between structural racism and zero tolerance policies in criminal justice. So how do you think those policies contribute to the school to prison pipeline?
Well, when we look at systemic racism, especially in regards to the penal system of the United States, one of the things that the esteemed colleague or the esteemed gentleman earlier, the professor, he suggested that this stems all the way back from slavery, which is actually the case. Actually, when you start looking at or examining Reconstruction, you'll see that a lot of white Southerners tried to implement a system through Black codes that mimic slavery. Once Reconstruction is over, you start to see a conscious push to try to put the situation and the conditions more like slavery than had been done in the previous decades. So when we fast forward to where we're at now, you'll see, as Michelle Alexander wrote in her book, that there are more people caught up in the prison system, and that's not just incarceration, but also probation and parole. They said there's more people involved in that system than there were slaves in 1860, right? But then again, this is no accident. America has shown a dependence on slave labor since its creation. It's almost like that one euphoric drug that the United States just can't get away from. Now, when we start talking about the the response, why people are starting to feel like this, right, is primarily because of the creation of social media. And now everyone has a personal communication device with a camera on it. So now when African Americans say things like, well, you know, police brutality is a real situation, we're believed a little bit more because now we have evidence. Unfortunately, police brutality is something that was discussed when I was listening to Malcolm X speeches when he was taping them back in 1964, when you talked about police brutality. So now people have the benefit of actually capturing this type of thing on tape and then projecting it to the world. Now, our current penal system, I don't think is going to change because, again, it's the dependency on it. Like, we are dependent on a lot of the labor that we don't talk about comes from prisons. At one point, you had Victoria's Secret. Military had contracts. Military gear was made in prisons. Some of the schools, the desks and the chairs for local education is made in prison. In fact, in California, they even have call centers and poultry. They're making, like, some of the poultry that's coming out of California used to be made in prisons. I think they might have modified it just a little bit, but when you see this addiction to slave labor, you see that type of addiction is very hard to get away from. So when you look at how we are addicted to this slave labor, the question is, well, who has traditionally been our source of labor in this country? And unfortunately, that source of labor has been minorities, specifically Black people.
Thank you. So we've got, that was great. I mean, all of you, we could just go on and on with this conversation, right? And we've got, I'm gonna have to take moderator privilege here to say that what we may do to make sure that we get to go a little bit deeper into this with our panelists is we are going to have a Q&A session at the end. I'm going to try to make up the time there, folks, but I just feel like we need to make sure that we address these issues in a very, educational, instructive way. And so I'm going to go on to the next question with Dr. Lang, even though there's a bunch I want to say in response to in response to Albert. But I'm gonna not do that and ask this question of Dr. Lang, because I think you can kind of take it where we need to go from what AJ shared. And that is that, Sir Winston Churchill said that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So, we continue to perpetuate structurally racist systems, and AJ just laid out how it just reinvents itself and how it's perpetuated. And what we see is that, what's been a challenge for me is just even engaging in this work to try to dismantle structural racism, but the beneficiaries of it, so this just really illustrates how it's pretty much designed to benefit white people at the expense of Black people. So what lessons can we learn from history so that we can figure out how to dismantle this mess?
So you raised the bar on me, Gwen. So I don't want to disappoint you. I don't know that I can do what you need me to do, but I'll try. I mean, I suppose one lesson. I think that in an odd sense we have to maintain a sense of optimism. AJ, if I can call him that, referenced Michelle Alexander's book. And I think one important point that we should take from that, and we should, as a social movement historian, and as someone who's been politically active at different points in his life, but those moments when Black people have organized and fought have not been for nothing. That when Black people have organized with allies across the board, that has had an impact on outcomes. Slavery was defeated, right, through the work of abolitionists. The Jim Crow segregation, that form of racial oppression, was battled and defeated by what we call the civil rights movement. I am old enough to remember when, before the year 2000, there were supposedly responsible officials who would argue against the idea that driving while black or racial profiling existed. That was 20 years ago. That's not ancient history. People had to fight to make sure that got registered. So the trick is to be able to pivot and recognize that as you defeat one form of racial oppression, other forms come into being, and that becomes the contradiction. So Black people's history has not been static, and so our position has changed from slavery to now. There is a thread of continuity in this, as we've been talking about, but Black people have fought, and they fought successfully. The trick is to anticipate where the next step is, right? So I think that right now we're at a moment where there's some real possibilities. There's a lot of danger, but people have gone to the street. People have stayed in the street. The President of the United States threatened to turn the full force of the military against the population, and people stayed in the streets, and he ultimately had to back down, right? And that sort of thing. So our struggle has mattered, and I think that the task now is to think about where are the pressure points. You know, we're not going to end racism or racial oppression tomorrow, but I am hopeful that there are ways to change the conversation, to change the landscape. So in one sense, we're in some really nightmarish times, but I think the level of popular movement struggle that's occurring, I think has been inspiring, even though there's a lot of risk as well as opportunity here. So this is I suppose the key point is, what do we know? We know that the resistance of Black people historically has mattered every bit as much as their conditions, and we have to keep that in mind as well.
So let me just add to that, you know, so hearing what you said triggered for me the importance of a couple of things, and to also to what AJ said earlier about we all have mobile devices with cameras, and we're recording and we're posting these things in social media, and it goes viral, and then that brings more people on board to see like this atrocity has occurred. And so if you know, from a historical perspective, that is what propelled the civil rights movement and brought the pressure, you know, that Dr. King and the young student protesters were fighting for into the forefront, so that it was undeniable that something had to take place relative to policy. It played out in TV. Before it got on TV, it was much more of an uphill battle. But it's also important to note that historically, you know, every single right that we have achieved was a fight. It was a battle. It was fighting through protest, be it nonviolent or violent. It was a battle. And so as we find ourselves now in this period of racial reckoning, it really begs the question, how many more hundreds of years do we have to wait to truly dismantle structural racism? And who is going to bring the pressure? So we bring the pressure from the street, we bring the pressure into the conversations, and we've been saying, the Urban League has been really saying Black Lives Matter since our existence. Now, white people are catching up, but the question is to white people, how much longer do we need to wait? And when will you bring the heat? When will you take the mantle of the fight? And so we have passed out at the end of this, well, you know, you'll be getting a book list, my reading list, Urban League's reading list. And on that list, I have your book, Jamala. But on that list, we also talk about Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, you know, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Because, you know, so if you study our history, then the way we really interrupt this perpetual cycle, this regression, this retrenchment of structural racism, is that we all have to begin to act and behave as anti-racist. So that book is on the list. And I just needed to go ahead and throw that in there. So that, because I think it was appropriate to put that in at this point, Dr. Lang. So I'm looking at the time, we've got about 15 minutes. So I'm not gonna get to the second question for everybody on the panel. Please forgive me, but you all did a great job. We want to see, do we have questions? Yes. Yes, I have questions coming in. And let me open them up here. Okay. This first question. Okay, this question is, as a practitioner of math, statistics, Six Sigma improvement processes, this person wanted to ask, how do we measure systemic racism in an organization or community? Expanding it expanding it immediately when people wish to express their lived experiences, there is an immediate ask to prove it with quantitative metrics, but qualitative measures are just as important. But what you can measure, such as some experiences, you can't approve, right? So that's the question. Who would like to respond to that question? Do I need to pick somebody, or is someone going to volunteer? AJ, you want to go after this one? He had that look like, yeah, I'll take the question. Unmute.
So I will go. I just started a debate league not too long ago on Facebook, and we actually had a debate on can Black people be racist? And one of the debaters brought some very interesting statistics to the debate in regards to how people were feeling as far as a scientific level, something that can be proven. Now, I'm not a statistician. I am a historian, so I want to go ahead and throw that out. I believe in staying in my lane. But when you start looking at the numbers, for example, when you look at the numbers of African Americans versus white Americans that get stopped or are convicted, right? You'll then be able to look at statistical information, statistical data that shows that there is structural and institutional racism in our justice system, right? When you also look at, for example, another issue that African Americans have been having to deal with, even though this is not really talked about, is housing, right? When it comes to housing, housing restrictions. When you look at the statistical data from that, especially in regards to places like predominantly white suburban areas, how are these entities still able to exist in 2020? How are we still having predominantly, not just overwhelmingly white suburban areas in the United States? How does that happen unless you are actually having a systemic form of marginalization when it comes to African Americans choosing homes? And that can be proven with statistics. So the statistical data and information is absolutely out there. The question is seeing it. Now, I'm sorry, I gotta go throw one more thing out there. When you start talking about ending institutional racism in America, the only way we're really gonna do that is if we restructure or completely redo our governing documents. As long as we still have protection for a transatlantic slave trade, 3/5 of a 3/5 clause as far as representation and taxation in Congress, a Fugitive Slave Act, as long as we still have those in our Constitution, regardless of the amendments, that still reflects white supremacy ideology on this country.
Okay, so one other thing I will add to the question about data is, we constantly are providing data. The disparities are there, they've been there, we've lifted them up in every aspect of this. And so the question really becomes maybe, it really, I think, requires a much better understanding of the real history of America, which is why we're talking about the history of structural racism. And certainly this conversation can't really get into it. So you got to kind of take personal, my response to this is take personal responsibility for when you see the data, then go do the research to understand what policies and practices were put in place to get the results that we are reporting in the data. And so you cannot see the relationship between structure, the policies, and the reason it's structural is that one policy layered on another policy, laid on another policy that pushes down one group of people, and while it lifts up the other, then you can't get your arms around, you know, with that Six Sigma, you know, all of that, you can't get your arms around, you know, what is the root cause of these disparities and how much more proof do we need to bring is the question. So, and I think the problem, let me finish. The thing here is that the history lessons, like we're having this conversation, so we need to have that history lesson in terms of, and that's why the book list that I provided is so darn important, because when you understand that history, when we took that trip to the Equal Justice Initiative, and it's laid out in plain view, so you can see why we have the incarceration rates. You can see why we don't have access to the economy. It's laid out. Until you see that, the data will always be perplexing. So I'm sorry, AJ.
No, I just wanted to say one thing to piggyback off of what you said. In 1968, the gentleman by the name of Otto Connor, he was a senator, was commissioned to write a report on why African Americans had went crazy. I believe he started it a couple of years earlier, but he publishes the report in 1968. It's called the Connor Commission. And in the Connor Commission, he pretty much explains that a lot of the reasons why African Americans are feeling marginalized like that is because of white racism, white systemic racism. Now, if we were going to look at American history like that, American history, period, it is impossible to discuss American history without discussing racism. And if you're not unwilling to discuss racism on any real level, then you're not really going to understand how America actually came to be.
Okay. All right. So let me get to the next question here because we got like 5 minutes. Are you aware of cities that are further down the road or have simply done a better job at correcting the negative impact that structural racism has played in their communities? If so, are there specific policies or programs that you could recommend our elected and business leaders consider implementing in Kansas City? So Geri, are you aware of anything? AJ? Well, Jamala, yeah, because you wrote about I was going to ask you a question. I was going to ask you about lessons learned, what we could do. So let me.
Yeah, and actually, AJ answered part of what I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about the Connor report because it's still valid today. 50 years later, when the New York Times said they had it right in the commission report, we're just not listening, it's still valid. Everything in there is still valid. I would say, because I'm so immersed in Missouri and St. Louis and Kansas City, I can't think of anybody that's doing a good job. I really can't. I mean, because racism is so fundamental. I think Clarence talked about it. It starts to mutate when you think you really can see it and understand it. Then it takes like another little shift. I don't know anybody that's doing that right. I remember when I did my book tour, in all the cities I went to, they kept saying, what happened in Ferguson could happen where I am, and it's true, and it has happened. So I really can't hold up any stellar examples of somebody doing it right. That's why all the cities now are up in flames with the latest, police murder. So if somebody else knows about that stellar example, case study, it'd be good to see that, but I don't know of anybody that's really doing it right.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. When I'm looking back at like historically what happened in a lot of cities like Washington, D.C. and Detroit, where I'm from originally, you think that maybe things might have gotten a little better over the years. I mean, like some of the things that we are talking about right now, we've been talking about this since before I was born, of course. And nothing really has changed. So when you go through a city, maybe like, I'm just going to use Detroit as an example, and you go through the riots, and then you have that, that reformation where you just kind of come up and make things a little bit better. And then all of a sudden you start going down again, and nobody knows like why, like who's at the helm, who is driving this boat. And things just kind of get skewed a little bit. And then, of course, then we just go into chaos, unfortunately. And you have, like one of the things that, that's been on the news, like how many Black on Black crimes are we going to talk about? Like, let's take the focus off of police brutality and let's put it on we're killing our own selves, not we, but that's what that's what I hear. And so I don't know what happens. Detroit went through that same transition where it was doing so well as, a predominantly Black city. And then all of a sudden it just went so far down, it couldn't even pay its light bill. And then I was going to say, well, maybe Minnesota, because Minnesota, Minneapolis has like a ratio, a higher ratio than any other place in the country of integrated couples. So I thought, well, maybe this is going to be a pretty liberal city, and eventually they would kind of get it together. But then, of course, what happened there. And so, I just don't really think that there's a good example, Gwen, of a city that has risen above some of the things that had happened all along historically. And I believe that. What did Winston Churchill say?
If you don't,
we have to learn from that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, what about the area in New Jersey? I believe this Camden, New Jersey. I'm not exactly sure, but the area that had a lot of police brutality, they end up dissolving their entire police department and then rehiring them and pretty much weeding out all those bad cops that we keep hearing about that just happen to be all over the country, right? They were able to weed them out, and then they were able to start policing on like a neighborhood basis to where crime started coming down. And the neighborhood started working with the police officers because they trusted the police officers, right? I think that would be a start, because our police officers mobilize like a military with almost little or no repercussions to their action.
Right. Yeah, I would agree, AJ. That is a good example of a best practice. We've been looking at the Camden model in terms of police reform. It was a very aggressive and progressive approach to reinventing law enforcement in Camden. And, for the most part, what we can see is that it's working in terms of building authentic community policing and reducing crime. So unfortunately here, there are a couple other questions that we just don't have time to get to, because amazingly, we started late because I screwed up with my being, not unmuting myself, and I thought I had. And so here we are, but it's 3:56. And I just have to say to you guys, thank you so much. You were, just as I knew you would be, is that you would show up and show out for this discussion. And what we're going to do is the Urban League is going to reconnect with each of you so that we can create an opportunity to continue this discussion where you do have time, so that we can, like maybe unpack these issues in a 90-minute setting as opposed to an hour. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to, I believe it's time to turn it over to Diane Cleaver, the President and CEO of the Urban Neighborhood Initiative. Diane.
And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Gwen, and to the Urban League and to Hush Blackwell, and to the hundreds of you who have joined us here today for this very important conversation. I have to say, I have truly enjoyed it, and I could have listened on, but I guess our time is up. They say, leave them wanting more. So I think that's what you all have done. I'm Diane Cleaver, as Gwen said. I'm the President and CEO of the Urban Neighborhood Initiative. We are an organization that works to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty and systemic racial inequities in the neighborhoods we partner with in the urban heart of our city. As we know, African Americans face far too many barriers to equality, to equity in our systems and institutions. Most of these barriers are by virtue of historic, federal, state, local laws, policies, and practices. So that makes it tough for us to address, but they have become part of our institutions and the way our institutions operate. And if we're ever going to achieve true equity, those barriers must be recognized, acknowledged, and dismantled. And that's what these conversations are about. They're a path to that. Today's conversation will continue next week. on Wednesday, July 15th from 3 to 4, as we discuss how structural racism has manifested itself right here in Greater Kansas City. And you got a bit of a teaser on that today, but I know that I am interested in hearing more about my hometown and my city. And on July 22nd, we'll feature the voices of Black youth. So very important. We'll have a panel of high school and college students sharing their experiences and their hopes for the future. And our final session will be July 29th at the KC Chambers Power of Diversity Breakfast with a panel of local leaders discussing what's next. We know we have to get to what's next, or it's all just conversation. The steps that need to be taken in response to all we've been hearing and learning. You can register for all 3 of these events on the Chamber's website, kcchamber.com. And I certainly hope you can join us. We thank you so much for being with us today and have a good afternoon.